Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Max Boot, the author of Reagan, His Life and Legend. He's written 6 books and is a senior fellow for national security affairs at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for the Washington Post. Thanks so much for being here, Max.
Great to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Until about 2015 or thereabouts, conservatives used the rallying slogan, "What would Reagan do?" as a call to arms on the federal budget, on taxes, foreign affairs, and on the government's role in our lives. He was held up as the beacon for what a president, a governor, a state legislator, and a candidate for dog catcher should try to be. George W. Bush modeled his presidency on honoring Reagan and avoiding the political mistakes that he felt his dad had made. But that has changed in the Trump era. Reagan's conservative example is no longer mentioned nearly as much. So, Max Boot, I ask you, have you found that this is because today's conservatives have changed what they value, or because Reagan's record has become more thoroughly examined?
I think it's because of the changing nature of the Republican Party. I mean, there has been an examination of Reagan's record, and I think my book contributes to that, but I don't think that's why Reagan is a less iconic figure in the GOP today than he once was. I mean, it can all be explained very simply with one word, and that one word, of course, is Trump. It's kind of an interesting divide in the current Republican Party, because I would say that while most Republicans honor Reagan at some level, he's really a guiding light mainly to kind of older fashioned conservatives, the Mitch McConnell types in the party who believe in Reagan's policies of peace through strength, international engagement, supporting allies. There was also a substantial part of the Republican Party that used to be pro-immigration, like Ronald Reagan. You certainly don't see a lot of that today. You also don't see a lot of Republicans who share Reagan's belief that he should be very gentlemanly and courtly and genteel with his political adversaries and treat them as wayward friends rather than as enemies to be destroyed. You see a very different ethos today with the Trump Republican Party, and that's why, a few years ago, Donald Trump actually overtook Ronald Reagan in polls of which Republican president Republicans most admired.
I was last at the Republican convention in 2012. And I've been to, I live in Florida and work in Florida, so I've been to dozens of Republican events. And, up until about that time when Trump took over the Republican Party, there were, you'd go to these events and you'd see sort of imitations, people trying to look like Reagan walking around all over the place. His picture was everywhere. Is that sort of expression of adoration present in the Republican Party when you go to their functions these days? I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I don't go to a lot of Republican Party functions these days. I'm an ex-Republican. I'm an
You're an
independent these
expat,
days. But I think it's fair to say that, yeah, the level of veneration is much less. Although I notice that, there's still, some of that around. Kevin McCarthy had a giant picture of Ronald Reagan on his office wall, but of course, Kevin McCarthy is yesterday's man in the Republican Party. He's been, he like Ronald Reagan and many others would be considered a rhino today.
Like so many presidents, views of what they did in office change over time from the, privilege of looking backwards. Some give extra credit to George H.W. Bush these days for overseeing the true end of the Soviet Union. Some conservatives have said for years that Reagan whiffed on Sandra Day O'Connor. Some conveniently leave out his views on gun control or Iran-Contra or his declining mental abilities over his time in office. Liberals point to deficits, to race relations, to the AIDS response, to the wealth gap that grew in the 80s. Moderates say that he was the inadvertent intellectual heir to a father to Bill Clinton. Does Reagan still have an intellectual home in today's politics?
I'm not sure if Reagan has an intellectual home because I think both parties have kind of moved on to the extent that Reagan's example is cited these days. It's often by Democrats rather than Republicans, with Democrats saying, how would Ronald Reagan react to X, whatever latest Trump shenanigan is in the news, suggesting that, you often hear it said that Reagan would be rolling over in his grave if he knew that X, Y, or Z was going on. But I don't think, there's not an exactly Reaganite party in America today. Certainly, the Republican Party has become much more populist and nationalist than it was in Reagan's day. And of course, the Democratic Party was never Reagan's party and still isn't. But I think that there is, even though Reagan's politics don't find an exact home in politics today, I think there is still a widespread affection for the man, and there's a reason why historians still generally rate him among the top 10 presidents in U.S. history, because I think there is a recognition, even among people who were not big fans of his when he was in office, there's a recognition that he was still, a great president who helped to revive America from the traumas of the 1970s, who, presided over an expanding economy, a revival of the national spirit, and most importantly of all, a peaceful end to the Cold War.
As I want to talk about your book a little bit here, as you followed the Reagan literature, particularly the big tomes. I read the H.W. Brands one. There's Luke Cannon, there's Craig Shirley, there's Edmund Morris. Had things been standing out to you all along that had been missing or not fully covered, or did you have to go digging to find what they had missed?
No, I did a lot of digging. I mean, I spent 10 years working on this book, talked to roughly 100 people who knew Reagan, read thousands of pages of documents. So it took a lot of work. And the reason I started this project in the first place in 2013 was because I didn't think that there was a definitive biography of Reagan, the kind that this president deserved. And I hope I've delivered that today. I don't think there has been up until now. There have been, what I like to say is there have been many books about Reagan, but not really one book that brings it all together and provides an objective and balanced overview of his career and his life that presents the good with the bad. And a lot of the Reagan literature to date has tended to be either hagiography or hit job. And those are the two extremes that I avoid. I try to, go right down the middle and to show both the good and the bad.
From what I've read so far, your book opens with a really incredible and also beautiful description at the end of Reagan's life. Incredibly, he had no idea why someone was recognizing him in public, or when he needs help to just stand the shallow end of a pool, and he was a great swimmer in the prime of his life. I really did feel like I was listening to someone describe the death of an ordinary person, what everyone with Alzheimer's ends up going through. How much work from a biographer's perspective did it take to make these final moments make him seem like an ordinary person on their deathbed?
I mean, it took a fair amount of work, a fair amount of reporting over 10 years, including, even just seemingly minor things that kind of slot into the larger picture. Like, for example, I developed a great relationship with the archivist at the Reagan Library at the National Archives in Simi Valley, California, and she got permission to share with me uh, the stuff that was in Reagan's desk when he died. Just the papers that were found in his desk, and those offered. And I briefly note that in a paragraph at the beginning of the book, but they offered fascinating insight into his mindset, because they had he had a lot of conservative materials on various right-wing topics. He had jokes that he had written over the years, one-liners that he used on the stump, but he also had an ad for riding boots, his great passion, of course, being horseback riding. So it was just fascinating to see. And then I actually got to see the actual desk that he used, which wound up with his former chief of staff, Fred Ryan. But and just talking to the people who were at his death side, including his son Ron, his daughter Patty, and others. And so just putting it all together and trying to form that picture. And that was certainly one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book, is about the way he had to deal with this horrible disease of Alzheimer's during the last decade of his life, which totally destroyed his memory, but it still left his, his personality was, there were still traces of his personality. And one of the fascinating things I found out was that, some people when they get dementia kind of turn mean or surly. I saw flashes of that with my own stepfather, who had Alzheimer's before he
Mm.
died. But nobody ever really saw that with Ronald Reagan. It was kind of interesting, because even stripped down to his essentials, his personality was basically so sweet and warm, that it didn't matter whether he had his faculties or not. He was still this, uh, in many ways, this admirable person.
When it comes to studying, you mentioned an archivist. When it comes to studying Reagan, give us a sense of how much material there is. I mean, we've talked to historians on this page, and they talk about the massive amounts of papers that any administration creates. So, as a bio, I imagine no one could ever go through all of it. It's millions of pages. Uh, how do you decide which ones you can give the time of day to or not?
That's a great question. That actually was, one of the things that I was constantly struggling with when I was in the archive, and, grappling with that very dilemma, which is, OMG. I mean, there is so much here. If I'm going to read it all, I'm going to be here for the next 20 years, literally, or 30 years. And even then, I probably won't read it all. As Robert Caro, who has spent like 50 years working in LBJ, even he can say that he hasn't read all the stuff in the
He
Johnson
does make a
Library.
point of saying that because there's
Yeah,
the wall when you walk into the Johnson Library is like the size of a building and it's all filled with paper.
yeah, no, it's daunting for sure. I mean, there's just this huge mass of material, and especially with the Reagan uh, papers, which are, more recent vintage than the Johnson papers, there is stuff being declassified all the time. And so the pile of papers that's available keeps growing. And so I just had to be very discriminating and understand, hey, I can't just go from A to Z, otherwise I'll be here for the rest of my life. I have to make strategic choices and think about, like, whose papers do I think are important? And then, you know, getting into one set of papers and then realizing, oh, here's a reference to something else. Let me go check that something else out. And there were certainly some serendipitous finds. That the one thing that I would say that I read all of is everything that was written by Reagan personally. That was, to me,
Hmm.
the most fascinating and important part
And
of the archives.
how much of that is there?
Well, there's quite a bit of it, but that's more manageable, because
Hmm.
it's really the letters that he wrote and dictated as governor and president mainly. There is some material from, before and during, in between his stints in office. Certainly, there's a lot from the 70s as well, but that was more manageable. Just, everything that Reagan wrote, which was a direct insight into his mindset, and it was fascinating. And I learned things like, for example, he was a wonderful letter writer, because he was somebody whose intelligence was sometimes questioned. But if you read his actual letters, I don't think I could always find the perfect way to put a letter the way that he did. It was just very beautifully done, and it wasn't ghostwritten. It was really him, and he just knew how to address everybody with, like, this perfect combination of wit and warmth and and informality. It was actually truly a pleasure to read his letters. Actually, I would say more so than his diaries, which were very, I thought, formulaic and unrevealing.
Is his handwriting easy to understand?
Yes, actually, he
Hmm.
has very good handwriting, much better than Nancy Reagan. I found Nancy Reagan's handwriting gave me a headache, but Reagan had very good penmanship.
And better than my handwriting, I imagine.
Yeah, better than mine for sure.
Incredibly, you did 100 new interviews. What was the reason you found that people decided to finally open up after all these years? And I imagine many, many interview requests.
That's true. I mean, I think there was kind of a sense of, uh, you know, setting the record straight in the court of history, and understanding that passions had cooled, and so they could be much more reflective about the president they knew than perhaps they would have felt free to be in prior decades, when whatever they said might be of greater controversy. I mean, what I actually found was that people who I interviewed, who had given many, many interviews over the years, folks like, Jim Baker, George Shultz, Colin Powell, While those interviews were useful, they were not nearly as revealing as some of the people who are not normal interview subjects. And for example, Stu Spencer, Reagan's political consultant dating back to 1966, the mastermind of every single successful campaign that Ronald Reagan ran, who's still around, very sharp in his 90s, living near Palm Springs. He was a wonderful interview subject, somebody who's never written a book and often does not talk to the media. Or there was also a fellow that almost nobody has ever heard of, who was probably Ronald Reagan's best friend when he was president, a fellow named Dennis LeBlanc, that I talked to, who talks to very few people. And who is Dennis LeBlanc? He was a former California state police officer who at one time was Governor Reagan's bodyguard. And then after Reagan left the governorship, uh, Dennis worked along with another ex-state cop named Barney Barnett. They worked together as ranch hands with Reagan on his ranch near Santa Barbara. And, there's this mythology about Reagan, hobnobbing with the rich and famous. I mean, that's not a myth, that's true, but it wasn't something that he enjoyed doing. He could put on a tuxedo and hang out with Alfred Bloomingdale and all these other tycoons, but that wasn't really where he felt most comfortable. That was really Nancy's milieu. As Dennis told me, President Reagan liked nothing more than to get sweaty at the ranch and to be one of the guys and just hang out with these blue collar ranch hands. And then they would all go back to to Reagan's very modest ranch house, have a very modest meal because Nancy watched her calories and everybody else's, and the meal was prepared by a housekeeper. And then they would all, pile onto the couch and watch Murder, She Wrote until they all fell asleep in the middle of the show. And this is, when Reagan was president. That to me is a great insight into what kind of person he actually was. And this is not something that you normally hear about him.
How long would you spend with an interview subject? I mean, just as an example for people out there, I'm a daily news reporter. I'll spend anywhere from, maybe someone on the street might be 5 minutes. If it's a longer interview, it might be 10, 12, 15 minutes. For someone writing a book that ends up being 700 pages, how much time are you spending to drill down with them?
That's a great question. I don't think I really spent less than an hour with anybody, but sometimes many hours. It really depended on what they had to tell me. And sometimes I would go back on multiple occasions, like with Stu Spencer, great interview subject. So I went back to him several times. And then when I was actually writing the book and I had questions, and I would email or call up Stu and say, "Hey, Stu, what do you think about this? Can you tell me about that?" So just trying to, get more of the story as I was writing the book.
Do you sit with them or do you call them?
I like to see them in person
Mm.
as much as possible, but obviously, like, when I'm writing the book, I'm not going to fly to California and ask a question. I'll
Yeah.
email or call up.
I'm a practitioner, a lover of very long, long books. I've read probably all the long presidential
Okay,
biographies out there.
my book is perfect for you.
Exactly. And I want to ask, did you plan on writing such a long book, 750 pages or so?
I didn't really have a plan when I started. I didn't really know what it was going to be. I kind of let the material carry me along. At one point, I was thinking maybe this should be a two-volume,
Mm.
and the publisher kind of entertained that. But I think we ultimately decided that no, it makes more sense to do it as a one volume. And I was, very glad that, I have a very supportive publisher in Norton. This is, something like my fifth book that I've done with them. I've worked with my editor, Bob Weil at Norton for many years. And, he was wonderfully supportive because the contract I signed more than a decade ago was for a much, much shorter book. So they would have been well within their rights to say, what the hell is this? Cut this by 50%. But they didn't do that because they understood that you needed room to tell the story. And so they were very supportive of the fact that it was not going to be, a short book.
That's a reporter's dream right there. I'm curious, is there a part of his life that you were scraping for sources on, that you were trying desperately to find things to illuminate something and you just couldn't find?
I mean, I think the hardest part to research in some ways, or to find new material, I would say, was, on his early years, because, once he enters politics, or even in Hollywood, Reagan is very amply documented because by that point, of course, he's a public figure, and there's a lot of people who write about their encounters with him. A lot of his letters are saved, but from his early years, it's fairly sparse material, and I was lucky that the archive granted me access to material which is controlled by the Reagan Foundation, not by the National Archives, which included, some of his early boyhood letters and school essays. I was lucky that Patty Davis reached out to Eureka College and got me his college report card, which they don't just give out to anybody. So things like that. But it was definitely it was a kind of, it was definitely much sparser material on his early years. And so without having a huge chunk of letters or a diary, it's a struggle to illuminate, his mindset, his inner mind. And so I did the best I could, but it's certainly not as complete as it is, for example, during his presidency when we have a day-by-day diary to
Yeah,
refer to.
minute by minute, practically.
Yeah.
Take us back to young Reagan. What can we find in his mom and his dad that foreshadows not just the type of person he would become, but that someone who would be so ambitious and become president of the United States?
Well, it's really hard to, I think anybody who knew little Dutch Reagan growing up in small town Illinois in the 1910s and 20s could have never imagined that he would grow up to be this movie star and president. I mean, he was definitely, I mean, as he liked to say, he wasn't born on the wrong side of the tracks, but he was certainly born with an earshot of the wrong side of the tracks. But that was, I mean, that was actually him putting a positive gloss on it. He actually was born in pretty desperate poverty. And, his father was an alcoholic shoe salesman. They moved from town to town every year or two. His mother and father had terrible arguments. It was a difficult childhood, no question about it. But his mother, and I think Nellie Reagan, his mother, really imbued him with the ambition and the self-confidence that allowed him to transcend his rural, small town, impoverished roots and to become a star on the big stage, because she was a very religious woman, but she was also a frustrated thespian and was always, giving poetry readings and putting on church plays and that kind of thing. And from his earliest years, Dutch was being given supporting roles in these plays that his mother put on in these small towns, and he learned to like the sound of the applause that he was getting, and that was really, he later ascribed his his ambition in movies to the kind of the positive reinforcement he got from those plays. And of course he became an actor in high school and in college plays. So that, that, I think that had a lot to do with shaping his personality. His mother also had a very sunny outlook on the world. She never saw the bad in anyone. She would go to prisons and hospitals and minister to people and try to help them. And that was also Ronald Reagan. He was also somebody who was very sunny, optimistic, very trusting, tended to accept people at face value. Um, from his father, Jack, I think he, said that he inherited his father's good looks and his gift to Blarney, because his dad was a shoe salesman, and he was kind of a raconteur in the Irish American mold. But I would say in general, most people who knew them growing up would say that little Dutch Reagan took much more after his mother Nellie than after his dad Jack.
I am a baseball fan, and I'm not just a baseball fan, I'm romantic about baseball. So I want to ask, what could be more romantic than someone sitting there learning to be a broadcaster in a little room with a microphone and a teletype? I guess that's what it was, or telegraph.
Yeah,
Um,
teletype. Yeah.
Teletype um, to hear what was going on in the Cubs games and then have to spit that back out to people listening on the radio. How did that form Reagan, and describe that incredible experience of having to do that as a broadcaster?
Well, that was really the origin of his, talent and skill in communicating, because he became a master of the medium of radio as he later became a master of television. And those were the skills that really allowed him to be such a successful leader as governor and as president. There he was in the mid 1930s, sitting in a studio in Des Moines, calling baseball games that were happening hundreds of miles away, which required this tremendous act of imagination to bring alive this tableau that you were not actually seeing for yourself, based on as you suggested, this teletype where all it offers you is this very shorthand description of,
Foul
ball
ball
hit,
to third
ground
base.
ball, strikeout, ball hit to third, whatever, pop fly, whatever. And then he has to make up all the rest of it. And there was, of course, one famous anecdote that he told time and time again when the teletype machine went dead. And he didn't want to say that on air because he was afraid that his listeners would change the dial. And so he just made up plays. He kept having the batter, pop up, foul ball after foul ball after foul ball for like 10 minutes before the teletype finally resumed, and he could actually share what was really going on. So that was really a master class in communicating and, conjuring up this world that he brought alive for his listeners.
There is a great video of Reagan throwing out the first pitch at Wrigley Field during his presidency. I guess it's probably towards the end of his presidency. And he just looks so happy and he looks so at home and he was so thrilled to sign the baseballs. What did baseball mean to him throughout his life? I just think it's a wonderful video. People should look it up on YouTube. He was so happy being on the baseball field. I guess like all of us baseball fans are.
Yeah, no, he loved baseball, but he loved sports in general. I mean, he was, a high school and college varsity football player. His eyesight actually was not good enough to really allow him to play baseball, but he did better with football, being a lineman. But he was also a great swimmer. And, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, Ronald Reagan had, very little ego. He didn't mind being criticized for things that he did in office. He would tend to brush it off. Nancy got much more worked up about it, but Reagan would tend to brush it off. But the things that he actually had some ego about, kind of interesting. One was his acting ability, which was often maligned. He really did not like to hear people make fun of his acting in movies like Bedtime for Bonzo. He got riled up about that because he thought he was a good actor, and he actually was a successful actor. But the other thing that he had an ego about was his athletic prowess. He really prided himself on being a good athlete, and he when he was in Hollywood, he liked nothing better. He didn't get to do this often, but he liked nothing better than to make pictures in which he got to be an athlete. His famous role as George Gipp, the Notre Dame football player, in the Newt Rockne story, and then he also played Grover Cleveland Alexander, the famous pitcher. So he really enjoyed those parts, and what he enjoyed most about it was just getting to play ball on the set. Basically, that's he loved doing that. And later on, his son Ron Reagan, told me about how when Reagan was governor in the late '60s, and his son Ron would be playing football with his friends on the front lawn of their house, and Nancy would tell Ron, "Don't bother your dad. He's got governor things to do."
Hmm.
But then, Reagan would be sitting there in the study and he'd look out at the kids on the lawn playing football and he couldn't stay away. And so he would go join the game. And his only condition being that he got to play quarterback for both sides. But that was what he loved doing.
Uh, like many people, he got a divorce. He was married to a woman named Jane Wyman. A lot of people forget that. How formative was that for Reagan? How critical of a turning point is that? It's hard to imagine President Reagan without Nancy Reagan.
That's exactly right. In fact, several of his closest aides told me that there would have never been a President Reagan were it not for his marriage to Nancy Reagan, because Jane Wyman was, you know, a better actress than Nancy Reagan. She won Academy Awards. She was one of the leading stars in Hollywood. But Jane was really focused on her own career, which was a lot of the reason why she and Ron got divorced, because Jane's career was taking off and her husband's career was in the doldrums, and they just had very different interests. But Nancy Reagan gave up her acting career when she and Ron married, and she really devoted herself for the rest of her life to taking care of her husband and promoting her husband to such an extent that even their kids often felt they were left out of this magical relationship that Ronald and Nancy Reagan had together. But what Nancy really brought to Reagan's life, aside from her love and devotion, was the fact that she was a very different personality type. Ronald Reagan was very trusting, very optimistic, assumed that everybody around him had his best interest at heart, whereas Nancy Reagan was very suspicious. She worried. She assumed that people were up to no good unless proven otherwise. And so they actually made a great team. And, as I think Stu Spencer described it to me, Nancy Reagan was really the chief personnel officer of Reagan Inc. She was the person who fired and hired on his behalf. And he really needed somebody to be that kind of tough, tough chief of staff for him, and to do the hard things that he didn't want to do.
One of the things your book describes is why he left the Democratic Party. You say I mean, it's hard to imagine like this iconic conservative being a member of the Democratic Party, but he was. And you say it was sort of this confluence of events, including conspiracy theory. The FBI was involved. He was a spokesperson for GE, and that had an impact. How did that happen, and when did it happen in his life?
That's a great question. And this is something I really had to unravel for the book, because most accounts up until now have basically repeated very uncritically Reagan's own account of what happened. He often said a million times over, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me, to suggest that, during the course of his adult lifetime, the Democratic Party went far to the left, and so Reagan was left to become a Republican. Well, that's simply not true, because the period when he converted to the right was really the 1950s and early 60s. This was at a time when the Democratic Party was very anti-communist, very centrist. Democrats like John F. Kennedy were actually in many ways to the right of Republicans on national security. So you can't say that these guys were, communist sympathizers. So you actually have to look elsewhere to see, why did Reagan go from being this New Deal Democrat who worshiped FDR to being somebody who avidly campaigned for Richard Nixon in 1960. And as you mentioned, that there were a bunch of influences that I found, including, the fact that he hated paying very high taxes on his wartime income, when, income tax rates were up to 90%. And he was making, as a movie star in Hollywood, he made a lot of money, so he had to pay a lot of taxes. He didn't like that. Then later, he lost his job at Warner Brothers, in part because the federal government broke up the monopoly that studios had, where they owned chains of theaters, which allowed them to subsidize their productions. And so Reagan, was very aggrieved, because he felt like the federal government was destroying his income. And there was some truth to that indirectly. He also got involved in post-war Hollywood politics, with the struggle over unions in Hollywood. And he became convinced, because FBI agents and others told him that the more radical union was part of a communist attempt to take over Hollywood, and he resisted that. And that's largely mythology, as I show in the book, but it was something he fervently believed. And finally, there was his role with General Electric in the 1950s, which really revived his acting career. And General Electric was a very right-wing company in those days, and they really proselytized their employees with right-wing text. And Reagan was always somebody who was eager to please his bosses, and so he imbibed a lot of the material that GE pushed onto its employees. So all these things came together, so that by the early 1960s, he was very far to the right, and very far from the young man who had worshipped Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s.
And I feel a little bit embarrassed that we're breezing through such a profound and important life in just a few minutes on this podcast. I want to ask just one question here about his governing style. The material that comes with the book argues that although he was an iconic conservative, that he really governed from the center. I want you to describe, and I went through some of the reasons why that might be the case earlier in the show here, but just describe, we had an author on this book, we had an author on this podcast who says, the advent of Reagan turned the entire tide of the country more towards conservatives than it had towards liberals during the FDR and Kennedy and Johnson years. How did you come up with that thesis that this is an iconic conservative who really governed in a much more moderate way?
Well, I think there's a very sharp differentiation in Reagan's life between campaigning and governing. When he was campaigning, he was very conservative, very right-wing, very ideological, often trafficked in conspiracy theories. In the early 1960s, he was claiming that the advent of Medicare and Medicaid, what he called socialized medicine, was going to turn America into a communist dictatorship. Pretty, far out there, John Birch Society type theories, which is why a lot of people expected he would be very right-wing as governor and as president. But in both jobs, he actually moved to the center. And, his very first budget as governor of California included the biggest tax hike and the biggest spending hike in California history up until that point. As governor, he signed the most liberal abortion law in the country and a very strict gun control measure. As both governor and president, he made deals with Democrats, whether it was Jesse Unruh, the Speaker of the California Assembly, or Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House. As president, he signed a bill that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. I mean, imagine a Republican doing that today. And of course, his most important achievement was he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev, the world's leading communist, to end the Cold War peacefully at a time when a lot of Republicans claimed that he was being duped by Gorbachev and that he was being turned into another Neville Chamberlain. But, Reagan actually showed that he could be extremely pragmatic in government. And that was really, I think, what made his presidency and his governorship a success, was that he didn't feel compelled to govern exactly the same way as he campaigned. He could pivot to the center, and he could especially, make deals. And he had nothing but contempt for Republicans or conservatives who went off the cliff with their flags flying, as he often said. His philosophy was that he would be content to take half a loaf today and maybe try to get more tomorrow, instead of saying, no, that's not good enough for me. So he was, very different from a lot of Republicans today, in that he really believed in compromise, and he really believed in working with Democrats. And that's why I think he turned into such a successful political leader.
The material that comes with your book says that there is a comparing and a contrasting that you do with Donald Trump. I want to ask the question this way: who would he vote for in this election, Harris or Trump?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I suspect he would probably vote for Trump because, he was such a loyal Republican from 1960 on. And you see that even with folks like Jim Baker, who worked for Reagan and Bush and is, often vilified by Trump. But even Jim Baker voted for Donald Trump. But I think that uh, while Reagan might have voted for Trump out of party loyalty, I think he really represented a very different Republican Party from the one that Trump leads today. And again, as I pointed out, this was a guy who signed an amnesty that for millions of undocumented immigrants, who was actually very pro-immigration. He was pro-alliance. He was pro-NATO. He believed that America should lead the world. He wanted to stand up to Russian aggression. And perhaps most importantly of all, he was somebody who refused to engage in name calling, who always treated his political adversaries with dignity and respect, and always believed in compromise, as I mentioned, not somebody who believed in the kind of slash and burn, take no prisoners political style that is characteristic of Trump today.
Now, I'm not going to use the age of my opponent against him. How do you hope future scholars use this work to make their own arguments in their own time?
Well, there's going to be no end of Reagan biographies, just as there's no end of biographies of FDR or Nixon or Lincoln or Washington or any other major president. People are always going to be finding new things and reinterpreting them, for future audiences. But I hope that, when this book comes out in September, that people will say that I got the story right, that this is the best account to date, and which a number of people have already said, including, I'm very happy to say, the president's kids, Patty and Ron, who have been very complimentary about the book and told me that they actually learned new things about their father from the book, which I took to be the highest compliment. So, I hope that the spirit in which I wrote it is I wasn't trying to, puff up or bring down Reagan. I was just trying to get the story right, and I hope that readers take it in that way and appreciate it for that.
This is a daring question. It's not a homework assignment. I want to ask, what other presidents would you want to take on in just this fashion?
Oh man, it's so hard. The reason why Reagan, to use the baseball metaphor, Reagan was kind of this big fat pitch right down the middle of the plate, because he is such a significant president, and there has not been a great biography of him. But it's hard to find other presidents where A, they were significant, and B, there's not a great biography. For example, I wouldn't dare to write a biography of George H.W. Bush because, John Meacham has done that, or I wouldn't dare to write a biography of of George Washington or Ulysses Grant, because Ron Chernow has done that. So there's so many, and don't get me started on Lincoln. There's like
Hmm.
bookshelves full of great
Five. Yeah,
biographies of
I
Lincoln.
think I have about half of them here.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of them. So that's a challenge, and that's something I have to figure out for, what's my encore, what's my next book. That's something I'm thinking about right now.
I love asking authors about their dedications to wrap things up. Your dedication is to two of the strongest women I've ever known, your wife, Sumi Terry, and your late mother, Olga Kagan. You say they've done as much to support me as Nell and Nancy did for Ronald Reagan. Do you want to say a few words about the support that a writer needs?
Yeah, it can be certainly a very lonely, isolating profession, and it involves working on something for a long time, and in this case for, more than 10 years. And so, you need a very understanding a spouse who will support you in that. But even to get to that point, I think you need very supportive parents, and in my case, especially my mother, who really, kind of shaped me and believed in me in the way that Nellie Reagan believed in little Dutch Reagan, and kind of imbued me with a love of learning, a love of literature, and a confidence that I could do this. And so I'm very grateful to both of them, and quite conscious of the huge debt that I owe to them.
Looking forward to reading the entire book. Max Boot, the author of Reagan, His Life and Legend. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Check out the book and his website, which is maxboot.net. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at maxboot. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.